The first topic we're going to cover in Colorado history is what is Western history. It's helpful to orient yourself, especially if you've never taken a Western history course, to what is not only Colorado history, but what is Western history and what is the larger study of American history. So that's where we're going to begin our discussion. So when we look at what is Western history and try to place Colorado and its history within that larger discussion, there are two topics that come up at least. Frederick Jackson Turner, a gentleman who published a thesis in the late 1890s, said that Western history is a process. However, I want you to start to think about history and think about it for yourself. Is history a process? Is Colorado history a process? Or is it something that's more organic? Is it something that we can't quite define? Is it a history in and of itself? So as we start to learn about Western history, it's going to be important for you guys to have a background about what Frederick Jackson Turner, thought Western history was and how we could start to understand it. So his definition of Western history was that it was a process where a place went from savagery to civilization. They went through the stages that you see listed here. They started as fur trappers and traders, went to miners, then farmers, ranchers, and finally the civilization became much more civilized when it became a civilization of industry. And that's when we start to see the development of churches, we start to see political organizations within any sort of civilization. So his definition of the West was that it developed that way in each and every place that we came. So the question that I ask you, though, is the outcome really civilized? Is it a civilization? When we look at Western history, I think it's helpful to compare it to early colonial history. It helps us to gain perspective, to see how it is not only similar, but also different. So when we compare the two, we see that the timeline is different in Western history and early colonial history. Western history starts around 1800, whereas colonial history starts around 1500. Religion is a reason for movement in both cases, but we see in the East, in early colonial history, a lot of the religious movements are Puritans, Quakers, people coming from over in Europe, whereas the religious movement is much smaller as we see it moving into the West. It's really only Mormons who come out west to settle for religious freedom. We then see that another reason that people move into the West and into eastern United States is for the land. And the difference here, I think, is that people are coming from Europe for the land in early colonial history, whereas in Western history, we see people not only moving from different parts of the United States, but they're still actually moving from different parts of the world to gain land. We also see another reason for movement is freedom, and so that's freedom of oppression from Europe originally in early colonial history, and we see freedom in a lot of different cases as being the reason for people's movement into the West. Freedom not only from oppressors perhaps in Europe, but we also see African Americans moving into the West as a place to own their own land, as a place to start as people who are free now. We also see Asian people moving into the West as a way to start in the world. The last area that we see as a commonality, I would say, is oppression. We see different forms of oppression in early colonial history and Western history, but we see many of the same themes running through early colonial history and Western history. And that's something we're going to talk a lot about. So the question for you now is, how does Colorado history fit into this larger study of Western history? Well, we've talked already about how it compares to early colonial history, and we've talked about how some people define Western history. Is it a process, or is it something that's much more organic and cannot be defined that easily? So I think it's helpful to look at Colorado as a place, first and foremost, much as the authors of our textbook do. They start the study of Colorado history by looking at the land. The land is very unique. As you can see from this map, we are surrounded by a lot of different states, and in early colonial history, the state of Colorado was actually divided among a lot of different political superpowers. So you can see just by the very location that we're in, we have a lot of people coming in from different areas. From the south, we'll see the Spanish and the Mexican people coming up to settle. They also own a portion of Colorado in early colonial history. We see then from the east that we'll see a lot of the colonists coming in to settle. We see then from the west that we have the Spanish, the Asian people coming in. So just by the nature of our location, we get a very diverse demographic. Another unique, I would say, thing about Colorado, and this is unique for each and every state, is the diversity of the tribes that's in Colorado. We have the Ute people traditionally in the 1800s, when we're going to start a lot of our discussion. They're settled in the southern portion of Colorado. We see the Kiowa and Comanche, the Cheyenne and Arapaho have come into the east of Colorado. We also see the Shoshone up in northern Colorado, and then the Navajo are not actually in Colorado, but they will move in and out of Colorado because they have a lot of interactions with different tribes, and there's really no definite political boundaries in that time. So in addition to the land, we saw a lot of diversity with the people who will come in and out because of where Colorado is located. You can see not only do we have the diverse population of Native Americans in Colorado, but we'll see the Spanish, the Mexican people, a lot of immigrants coming into Colorado from not only the west, but also the east, coming to settle from perhaps eastern portion of America, because that land is really crowded by the time that Colorado becomes a place of possible settlement. And then once again, we also mentioned the African American people. We see them start to come out west after they gain their freedom from slavery. And this is a place not only to work, but to eventually, for a lot of them, own land and become owners of that land. So as you can see, when we start to look at Colorado history, our big look is first where it fits within the larger study of American history, how it compares to early colonial history, and then how we start to look at it in terms of what that larger study of Western history is. Is it a place that's organic and changes, and that's how we start to understand the history? Or is the history a process, one that goes through all of those steps that Frederick Jackson Turner has defined?